and reduce resource use. Not only does this minimize environmental impacts, but saving energy, water, and materials translates into real bottom-line financial savings for businesses. The National Cleaner Production Centre South Africa, NCPC-SA, drives the implementation of RCP methodologies in industry. The NCPC-SA is a South African government program and one of a growing number of NCPCs around the globe affiliated to RCP-Net. Through its range of subsidized services, the NCPC-SA aims to support industry in the transition to a low-carbon economy, helping companies to review and improve the way they do business. What is driving us to review the way we are doing business? The increase in greenhouse gas emissions, such as carbon dioxide and methane, and the resulting changes to climates around the globe, is one of the reasons we're reviewing how we do business. We are also seeing a limited supply and in some instances a scarcity of available natural resources such as oil, gas, coal, and water. Oil reserves, for example, have dropped to 50% of the totals projected. Energy is not only becoming more scarce, but more expensive. Between 2007 and 2015, the price of electricity in South Africa increased by 300%. Average rainfall in South Africa is half the global average, and more than 80% of available surface water is already being utilized. Pollution and the increased frequency and severity of droughts place further pressure on this resource. Global and national population growth figures mean increased competition and demand for valuable resources, further stressing our already strained reserves. Based on these drivers, it is imperative that initiatives such as RCP are undertaken to decouple population and economic growth from the demand for resources. When looking at the holistic benefits of adopting RCP, these can be broken down into three key sustainability dimensions, namely economic, environmental, and social benefits. Speaking economically, RCP improves production efficiency and profitability. Savings realized on raw materials, waste disposal costs, and energy and water bills ensure a quick payback and year-on-year savings. RCP interventions can also improve environmental compliance, operating efficiency, and product quality, as well as open new market opportunities. The environmental benefits speak for themselves, reducing the demand for scarce resources and minimizing pollutants and waste. This also has a benefit on the communities around the plant, and the company's image as a socially responsible producer and employer are enhanced. Resource-efficient and cleaner production represents a win-win strategy for industries, the environment, and surrounding communities. Watch the next video for an overview on the RCP approach of doing more with less. The National Cleaner Production Centre South Africa is a program of the Department of Trade and Industry, hosted at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. For more information, visit www.ncpc.co.za.
Now you can have your phones on silence and start tweeting. Tell their friends and family. We are at the CSIR Convention Center and we are attending the National Green Industry Conference. I'm sure they would be very interested in knowing that. I wish we were live. You know, I like these soccer games when you tell your wife and kids that you are going to school or you're going to work, and the next thing they see you on TV going. So I would like to encourage you to send a tweet so they remember where you are, and also remind those that are still on the way that they are missing out. Is that good? So, yeah, you are allowed to have your phone on, but on silent. And believe me, there's a danger in putting the phone on vibration. So please put it on silent and keep it next to you. I want to share with you a few information that would help build up a good understanding of the NCPC. The National Cleaner Production Center, the mandate that we are given by the Department of Trade and Industry is that we need to improve competitiveness and efficiency of the South African economy or South African production economy using RECP, resource efficient and cleaner production methodologies. Now, this methodology has a number of tools. If you want to learn more about these tools, it's in the presentation, but let me enjoy talking to you. You just go into www.ncpc.co.za. There's a list of training courses available for you. An average of this training, if you were to go to any academic institution, private or public, you are not going to pay less than an arm and a leg. But if you come to us, it's almost free. We only charge you so that you could appreciate the food we give you when you are attending. And so the training is there. And the other idea is that we need to grow a pool of experts in the continent that are available and reliable for us to achieve and stimulate. You know, it's our way as Africans to facilitate this agreed African trade agreement. And this is a way of doing that. There are about 18 NCPCs in the continent at the moment. 15 of those are very active, and they are doing the same things we are doing, if not better, some of them, to what we are doing. And they need you to come and help make their works as simple and as reliable as possible. Now, allow me, you see, I must keep reminding you we are in Africa and we are Africans. So we start either by apologizing before we start talking, or we start by dancing and singing, then we welcome you. And if you are paying lobola, they even feed you, then they welcome you. So allow me to just acknowledge a few of our friends and partners in the NCPC and the Department of Trade and Industry and the CSIR. We have the partner or collaborating partners in the continent. So we have NCPC Ghana, represented by its director. Do you want me to make you stand and wave your hand? It's nice, eh? You see? And we have NCPC Kenya, the Deputy Director of NCPC Kenya. We have NCPC Uganda, Deputy Director of NCPC Uganda. I'm looking at Zimbabwe. Okay, we have the CEO of the Zimbabwean Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And then Mozambique, I can't see them. Tanzania, okay, they're probably still on their way. But I also want to acknowledge some of our panel members. Will introduce them when we go to that point. But the Department of Trade and Industry, Department of Science and Technology, Department of Environmental Affairs, National Treasury, and we also have the different provincial departments that we are working on or with in a number of projects. You will note that I'm not giving you the names because I want you to use the app. I hear someone saying, "Who are you?" So you go to the app. Julie told me, because everyone knows Julie here, She told me I'm the most famous guy, and I just tweeted to my kids and said, I am a celebrity. You go to the website, you find my face. So it's me. Hi. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the CSIR, and thank you for joining us. I'm now officially acknowledging everyone. I see quite a few of our industry partners and embassies. Okay. The United Nations Industrial Development Organization. Thank you. You want to also wave? Okay. But I see your team didn't do that as well. Okay. United Nations Environment Agency. If I still say UNEP, you'll forgive me. But and then United Nations Development Program, UNDP. Okay, all right. But if you want to know more, go to the app and you will get a list of all the people who are here. By the way, some of them have got nice passes, and the passes are overflowing. So you might be lucky if you do it well. Can I also acknowledge Sanedi, the senior manager from Sanedi? I thought I saw him. Oh, okay. And I forgot the Department of Energy. Did I say it? The Department of Energy. I can hear the person saying, okay. No, I didn't forget. I wanted you to be special. I think I forgot who else was here. That's how clever I am. But everyone is welcomed, and thank you for joining us this morning. Now, in terms of our mandate, the RECP methodology works better when you divide the activities. This is in the South African context, because if you go to Uganda or Ghana or Switzerland or Germany or United States or Australia or Netherlands, they simplify it in different ways, but basically everything else comes to the same methodology. We have in South Africa chosen to define it by saying you focus on 4 thematic areas. So the first one, relevant to South Africa at the moment, it's energy. And the second one, it's water. And the third one is materials. And the third one of material includes waste. You are aware that waste is now the talk of town. And what we do within this 4 thematic area, it's we're building knowledge for South Africa to understand how RECP methodology could be used to make your plant or your company or the sector that you belong to more effective, reliable, and responsible as well, for the benefit of your great-grandchild. So when they are here, they would be proud, my grandfather, my great-grandfather lived in South Africa in 2019, and he made a mark. And we do free services and implement resource efficiency and cleaner production methodology tools. Underline the word free, because if you have not benefited from the NCPC, it means the world is leaving you behind. We also offer training courses. They are customized to meet the needs of a plant manager or a floor worker, but also they are relevant to a government official and an academic person. So the courses would be able to meet the needs of all the stakeholders. You can get this access to these tools for free online, ncpc.co.za, if you want. But it's always good to make us feel important, to call us and ask for us to come and help you. And that makes us feel we are still very relevant. We also trying to build ourselves to become an advisory institution for the country. In terms of the data that we are now building and the amount of baseline that we have, It's good to advise and inform your decision either on capital projects or on upgrading projects or on regulatory compliance purposes, for purposes of compliance. Just an example, from 7 sites that we worked on water, specific on water issues, we were able to, I'll come back to this slide, we were able to save about 24.5 liters of water. Now, how our results are presented is that they must address 3 important things. 1, we must be able to tell you the saving in financial term, rand's value. Secondly, we must be able to tell you that that rand value is equivalent to how much carbon emission you have reduced. The third way we do that, and we are able to then confirm to you the kilowatt hour or the gigawatt hour or the kiloliters or the tonnage equivalent of environmental saving or compliance that you have achieved with what you have done. And this talks to your carbon tax responsibilities. It also talks to your bottom line responsibilities. But we also want to be shy about it, that it is important for us to protect the environment and protect it for the future generation, for them to have access to these resources. I saw a documentary in Kenya, which was done in Kenya a week ago on Discovery Channel, and they were talking about a collaboration between Kenya and the Netherlands and the Scandinavian country, I forgot the name, where they were now breeding a white rhino from stem cells or from things that were saved because it has extinct. And I thought it's going to be very difficult to explain what other species are, just as I have no idea what these species, some of these species are today. So you can imagine in 10 years, if we don't do that, what will happen to our generation. The one other priority area in the organization is the National Foundry Technology Network. And this is as important as anything in the economy. Everything we do in the economy starts with a foundry. I don't know if you're aware of that. You have to mold, and everything you do is molded by a foundry. And our foundry in South Africa, it's either very old, we call it matured industry in the GTI. You know, I've learned political language. You don't call it old industry, you say matured industry. And it's either in the typical South African sense, the guys who are running it are all above 55 years of age. And you can imagine even the race and the character of that industry. And we are saying we need to protect this industry, it cannot die. So we have priorities to facilitate the sustainability of the foundry industry in South Africa from extinction. And your job is to begin to say we promote proudly South African product, because they come from, if nobody buys South African, then whoever is manufacturing will not have a reason to go to a South African foundry to access materials and goods and services to produce whatever you want to have in your house. And the priorities of the foundry industry is to build capacity. We need to have more younger foundry men in South Africa. We need to have, a few years ago when they started with the ESCOM project in Medupi, the talk was, we don't have enough young boiler makers. Did I say it right? Sounds wrong when you say boiler makers. You don't have enough young boiler makers. So we need to participate in a process where we develop young aspirant boiler makers, young foundry men to come out so that we can sustain the industry. We are looking at regulatory compliance issues, and you can imagine a foundry, it's as interesting as a tannery. If you've been to a tannery, or if you're wearing a leather shoe, you must just imagine where it comes from. And so we need to make sure that that place, you can eat your food and not want to run to the bathroom. We're also helping with skills development in the foundry. And the idea is that we need to create a form of support that allows the industry to regenerate itself, but also to stimulate new interest, new interesting area. And by the way, there are academics in this room. When I grew up, I used to hear that South Africa is one of the leading intellectual property rights countries or developers in the continent or in the world. And we need to get back that mojo and become a leader in that platform. And for Africans, it's more interesting because there's a lot more that have not been explored in our continent, and there's a lot more that is available for us to do, not only from an economics point of view, but also technical and environmental issues. So we want to encourage people to consider that. The screen went black, and it's just telling me I have spoken enough, and I need the show to start. Are you ready? Now, can I ask you to help me welcome the person sitting? Oh. I had to calm myself down. I am an aspirant pastor. So this thing, when I said that, I thought I'm in church, so I wanted to stand and start walking around. You see, you look like people who are ready to receive it now. Can I throw it? Are you ready to catch it? All right. Can I ask you, there's someone sitting next to you on your left-hand side. Can you just look on your left-hand side and say, welcome? And standing in front of you doing that makes me feel sorry for the person on the right. And I can tell you, you are not left alone. So turn now and do it to the person on the right-hand side. Thank you so much for that. Don't worry, it's now going to Venda, to Thohoyandou, so it's taking longer. Hi. Okay. Yes, sir. Ah, okay. That's fine. It was made strategically. I asked them. You see, with my black bone, you see, yeah. Yeah, no, so the idea was for me to be visible. Please join me in welcoming the Chief Director of the DTI Green Industry in the Industrial Development Division of the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. Ish? Yeah. Okay. Mr. Gerard Faure, so because he's my boss, I'm asking you, make him feel so special that he can give me a raise. So we can clap hands for him.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for that introduction. And Dee, I don't know if you know that he's a pastor on the weekends. So he runs a couple of churches, and I think your church skills is very useful in running conferences and running the NCPC. I don't know which church you go to. If somebody thankful for the vision they had in those days and for the knowledge and expertise, that foundation that was built up in South Africa over this period. And they also played a leading role in helping establish these concepts across the continent and even in other countries in the world. You saw in the videos that the environmental challenges and industrial challenges that we have in South Africa, but I think it's also important to just reflect on exactly where all of this comes from. There's a lot of data available now, and if you look at the data, you'll see that the global population remained quite low and stable for literally tens of thousands of years. I think in around 1900, we sat on about 1 billion people. But since about the 1950s, we went into this period of, that many people call the Great Acceleration. The population of the globe started to grow almost exponentially. Global consumption started to grow exponentially. Global demand started to grow exponentially. Energy consumption, fertilizer use, water use, all of these things literally is a direct correlation, started to grow exponentially. And basically it was basically driven by technology innovation, cheaper and more efficient transport, telecommunications, IT, and it really, at the end of the day, led to a massive global middle class that's got a huge appetite to spend money. Now, what we also see, and it might be difficult for us to understand, is the gap between the rich and the poor in the world since 1950 has decreased quite substantially, and there's literally a few billion middle-class people very eager to spend money. Now, of course, at the end of the day, it's very nice to have economic growth, and we all want to see that, and we all want economic growth to continue, but it has quite a negative impact on the planet since the 1950s. Carbon dioxide also grew exponentially, nitrous oxide grew exponentially, methane, ocean acidification, the number of fish we capture, the nitrogen in the coastal zones, and the deforestation. All of these things happened basically at the same rate as we saw this massive economic growth. Now, the planet as we know it is capable of dealing with all of this. And something that I always like to remember is everything we have is basically a service from the planet. All the minerals we use, all the oil we use, all the oxygen we need to live, all the water we drink is a service from the planet. And everything all our waste, we feed back into the planet, and the planet has to process this. Now, what we've seen, and the data very clearly illustrates this, is that the planet is basically reaching its boundaries, and we've basically transgressing this boundaries that is basically allowed this safe operating state for tens of thousands of years. Now, since the signing of the Paris Agreement, we've seen that many countries, many large financial institutions, the insurance industries, companies with global footprints have decided to act on this. And when we monitor it at the DTI, we see a lot of legislation in countries being implemented, new standards, a reallocation of funding and capital away from things like mining, coal-fired power stations, even fossil fuel industries, towards environmentally sustainable industrialization. Now, for us, it might sound like quite a big threat. We are one of the most carbon-intensive countries in the world, and at the same time, we sit with massive unemployment and massive inequality. The guys that created this problem are all wealthy, They sit with negative population growth, and they want their kids to have a good life. But we have to deal with this problem with the rest of the world. Now, the way we look at it at the DTI is it can either be a big threat to South Africa, but it can also be a massive opportunity. If you analyze all the new industrial possibilities, when you decouple growth from carbon, for example, I mean, we look at renewable energy, the introduction of, or the combination of electricity, IT, and telecommunications in smart grids, green transport. There are lots of new opportunities available to us. So basically, going forward, a big focus of the DTI is to look at how do we align industrial policy and our environmental objectives. So we've done quite a bit of work on the steel industry, aluminium, petrochemicals, fossil fuel, transport sectors, to see which of these industries, how far can we improve these industries, which of these industries has got growth potential going forward, which industries do we have to try and maintain for as long as possible. And a lot of this data came out of the work that the NCPC and the group of consultants that work with the NCPC, a lot of this data is basically what we mined out of the system. So going forward with the NCPC, we've implemented an integrated management system to really now, we're busy implementing it to really capture this data in a much more useful database and to use this data a lot more to inform strategic decision making going forward. And we're really looking forward to position the NCPC also as a center of excellence in this space to help inform how we guide our economy to keep high levels of employment, to grow our employment, to grow our GDP, but also to do it in an environmentally responsible way. And if you'll see also that the government's really serious about this. When we look at our contribution to GDP, we see that the traditional industries like steel and mining is a very important component of our economy, but they basically remain stagnant. They're not really growing that fast. So we've got to really look at other industries, and National Treasury recently also sent a very important price signal to the economy that we, through the implementation of carbon tax, to try and steer the economy in that direction. And I'm looking forward to the discussion now next on these topics and on the outcome of the conference and especially on how we can address the challenges facing South Africa. Thank you.
Okay. We have a colleague of ours, a partner and a friend from Egypt. Prof, I have not. Where's Prof? Okay. If you could also wave to the people. Now, Prof is from the Metallurgical Research and Development Institute in Egypt. It's an NFTN peer or colleague. So he's here to workshop and talk. And he'll be here again, I think, before end of the year, specifically to speak to people in the foundry industry. So if you want to say hi to Prof, you want to interact with him, he is a world-renowned expert and is an encyclopedia. So, okay, so please do that. May I ask all NCPC employees or staff members who are in the room to stand? And if you could just turn around and wave to the team. Now, if you have any query, you want to know anything about NCPC and NFTN, these are the guys you should go and talk to. If you have a company and you want to address certain things, or the discussions we are going to have right now makes you feel, either you get goosebumps or you get, what's the opposite of goosebumps? Numb, you get numb. These guys who are standing now will be able to unnumb you. That's a nice word. They will be able to help you deal with that. So, guys, can you be the ushers? I know I didn't agree with, or discuss this with you, and help our friends to be comfortable and enjoy. May I invite to the front, we're going to have a panel discussion. Charlene from National Treasury, and Gerard from Deloitte and Touch, and Jocelyn. Okay, forgot the name. But anyway. Now, the idea is that you are going to participate in this discussion. And Julie is going to lead the discussion. I'm told I'm almost trying to do an altar call, so I must get out of the stage. So thank you so much for listening to me, and enjoy the rest of the day. God bless you.
Thank you. Okay, are we on? I'll wait. There we go. Ladies and gentlemen, our fearless leader, Nduvo Rapulu, thank you so much for serving. Thank you for your inspiration and your jokes. It's never a dull moment when we have Nduvo being program manager. He needs to go and do a radio interview, and we'll be entertaining people on Channel Africa soon. So I'm just going to thank him, and I will take over from here. So myself, I am Julie Wells. I am the Communication and Marketing Manager for both the NCPC and the NFTN, a job I find both a pleasure, a challenge, and a privilege. And you will see as we go through the next 2 days that we have made every effort to live what we preach. Okay, so you will not have been able to bring in plastic water bottles today because we haven't paid for or ordered any plastic water bottles. Okay. Your name tags have not been put in pouches. Not because we didn't have the budget, because we don't need them. Okay, when you leave, if you'd like to keep your lanyard, you're extremely welcome to reuse it, but please don't take it home and let it lie in your drawer. If you're not going to reuse it, give it back and we will reuse it. The pieces of paper that have your name tag on, we all know they can go in recycling. So all of these steps are little things, but they're behavior change, and that is what our panel here today is about. It's about something that has been put in place by our national government to bring about behavior change. Because the truth is, unless you give someone a carrot, or unless you show them a stick, the chances are they're not going to change the way they behave. So today's panel is going to address how to reduce the impact of carbon tax on industry. Not, do we need carbon tax? No, that's been talked about. The decision's been made. Okay, now what? So the projector room is going to put a number up on the screen just now, and that is where you're going to WhatsApp your questions. Okay, it's going to save us time, it's going to save us effort, and it's going to mean we can address more of your questions. If 2 or 3 of you have similar questions, we have a team that's moderating the questions, well, not moderating, but amalgamating the questions into similar questions. And in the next few minutes, the panel will introduce themselves and say what they're going to come here to say, and then we will start asking them questions. I'm missing a panel member. Alf? Alf is going to join us in a moment. Alf is here to speak about what companies can do to save to reduce their carbon footprint. Okay, so I'm going to take my seat now, guys. It's going to be, oh, let's have a look. Okay, so we're here for about 45 minutes. So I need to sit. Because every now and again I haul out my heels and I look professional, and today's one of those days. So we're going to start by asking the panel members to briefly introduce themselves, very briefly, like 30 seconds, and then we're going to come back and ask you guys questions. Starting with yourself. Okay, is the other mic working?
Good morning. My name is Charlene Emraj. I'm from the National Treasury. I'm responsible for environmental and fuel taxes and been instrumental in the work on the carbon tax.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Gerard Bolt. I'm from Deloitte, from the Global Investment and Innovation Incentive Service line. I provide technical support with regards to energy and climate change, and we predominantly focused on government grants and incentives, and in this particular instance, disincentives.
I'm Jocelyn Lydell, and I'm from Catalyst Energy Solutions, and we focus on helping clients to reduce the impact of the carbon tax.
Alf Hartzenberg from the NCPC. I lead a flagship program, the Industrial Energy Efficiency Project. And through our work in industry and in particular guiding and assisting companies improve their energy performance, the carbon tax has become a big consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. If anyone can't hear, please just wave at the back so that I can notice and we can maybe ask people to turn up or speak up. Okay, I'm going to start with a question to you. Why do we have carbon tax? What is the purpose? What is the aim? And if you could briefly take us also through the process that government underwent before putting this in place.
Thanks, Julie. Well, it's only been 10 years since government first put forward the carbon tax. So to have the act actually come into force on the 1st of June this year was quite an effort of the Treasury, but also supported by Department of Environment, Forestry, Fisheries and Energy. So it was a coordinated effort to get to this point. But I think the question on why a carbon tax, I think maybe we can throw that back and say, if not a carbon tax, then what to address climate change? Because the reality is that we are in a crisis, in a climate crisis, as developing economies, which South Africa is still a part of. We face immense challenges in terms of reducing our emissions as well as addressing our economic development, poverty alleviation objectives. And as part of that, how do we make a just transition? And that's the context in which the carbon tax was considered. So why? So I'm just going to put out a few statements. One, Paris Agreement, which came into force in 2016. South Africa ratified the Paris Agreement and submitted a target for us to reduce our emissions. As part of this submission, under the Paris Agreement, we outlined a range of policy measures, of which the carbon tax was a part of that. I think the second issue is that, which Gerard touched on, is that as much as we claim to be a developing economy, we rank 14th in the world in terms of absolute greenhouse gas emissions. In addition to that, if you look at our emissions per capita, it's comparable to developed countries. So how is that possible when we still need people to have access to electricity? And I think the third issue, just to say why a carbon tax, is that, which is purely from an economics perspective, is that if you're looking at climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, you have all of these externality costs that are incurred. And they are incurred not by people that actually do the production, but if you're looking at it, society at large, you're looking at people living in rural areas. And if you're looking at an activity like electricity generation, for example, you've got both emissions of greenhouse gases and emissions of sulfur dioxide. And I think we've learned recently about the Mpumalanga region being one of the most toxic in the world in terms of emissions of sulfur dioxide. So these costs associated with emitting these substances are not included in the prices of goods and services, whether it's electricity, whether it's industrial products, etc. So from a policy perspective, the need for a carbon tax is to explicitly put a price on these emissions, and by putting a price on these emissions, create some incentive on the margin, because we're not taxing all emissions, but to provide an incentive on the margin for both producers, consumers to start to think about what type of products they use, how do they change the way in which products are manufactured, and specifically around how do we make this shift towards away from a carbon intensive towards a more low carbon, climate resilient economy, and especially for our energy sector, how do we start to shift away from coal towards renewable energy and energy efficiency. So that's the context in which the carbon tax is considered. It's viewed as part of a package of measures, so it's not a silver bullet that's going to result in zero emissions by tomorrow. The way the tax has been designed is that it starts at a relatively low rate compared to what is being proposed internationally. Some of the rates that are being proposed is ranging from 40 to 80 US dollars per ton. Our tax comes in at a low rate of around 120 Rand, with a whole range of tax-free allowances. And why did we do this? Well, the reason was that, we wanted to provide the space in which industry can have to transition, to create the signal on the margin, and then over time to respond to the way in which the market responds in terms of how we can adjust the rate of the tax. So that's essentially where we're coming from with the tax. The process has been long. It started in around 2008. There were various discussion papers put out and policy documents, and the reason for that was to start to sensitize the public around the approach that was going to be taken, to make a case for the role for a carbon tax. There was a policy paper put out in 2013, and there were two versions of the carbon tax bill that were actually published in 2015 and 2017. I think what's important to note is that this has been an extensive consultative process, and there has been several concessions made in the way the tax is designed. And specifically, two issues I just want to raise is that, firstly, we committed to, for the first phase of the tax, up to December 2022, we committed to having no impact on the price of electricity, and that will be achieved through electricity generators offsetting the payment of the electricity generation levy against their carbon tax liability. And I think the second issue, which will probably be touched by colleagues later, is that as part of the discussions through Parliament on the carbon tax, we proposed in this budget to extend the duration of the energy efficiency savings tax incentive, the 12L incentive, so extending that to December 2022 to be in line with the carbon tax. So, thank you. So the tax has been put forward on the margin to serve as that stick or penalty and to nudge the economy onto a more sustainable growth path, but at the same time to say that, look, we have to cushion certain sectors, households over the short term as we make this transition.
Okay, my back on. Thank you. That was honestly one of the best summaries I've heard in a long time as to why we need this. We'll come back to this, but there are two things I'd like people to take note of that we'll come back to later. First of all, the Paris Agreement. Those of us who work in this sector, we mention the Paris Agreement as everyone knows what it is. Not necessarily the case. Those of you who don't, essentially it's the term we use when we speak about the agreement that all the nations of the world, minus a few notable large exceptions, signed in 2015 in order to commit to reducing their GHGs. And the other thing that was mentioned is this notion of the generation, the electricity and the power generation sector. Many of you may not know that when Department of Environment and Forestry and Fisheries, as they now are, identified where we should be reducing our carbon where we should be offsetting, where we should be mitigating, we realized as a nation that by far the greatest area we need to work in is power generation. I think, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, the targets that were set for 2020, 40% of those targets lie with the ESCOMs of the world, and obviously not just ESCOM, but the others. Closely behind each other are then industry, and then there's the agriculture, forestry, and land use sector, and help me, I can't remember what the fourth one is, but industry is next. There's a big gap between what industry needs to do and what power generation needs to do, but this is the reason we're doing this. So I'd like us to remember that, to come back later. Industry, which is represented in this room, carries the second largest burden in the nation for reducing those emissions. And then, Gerard, while I'm handing over to you, I'm going to ask you to maybe, I'm going to be unfair, I'm going to throw something into your pot. We were talking about not every emission is being taxed. I don't know whether you can touch on that in your when and who and how, but Gerard is now going to take us through very briefly what companies are being taxed on, when they're going to have to pay, how often they're going to have to do a return, how the whole thing works. Over to you.
Thank you, Julie. I think let's kick off with your immediate question. I think when comparing carbon taxes to, let's call it international efforts or international rates, just looking at the actual headline tax rate of 120 Rand per tonne might be a little short-sighted and maybe only one part of the coin. So, for example, Sweden might have a tax rate a lot higher than we do. You mentioned values of 40 to 45 US dollars being more reasonable for a tax. The reality is that a very large part of South African emissions, and as a matter of fact, 80% of our emissions are covered by the carbon tax. So I think a fair comparison between countries would rather be to take the tax rate and multiply it by the amount of emissions that it covers. So, for example, other jurisdictions might have a fairly large carbon tax rate, but it might only be focused on transportation fuels, diesel and petrol, for example. Yes, so in terms of which emissions are not covered by our tax at the moment, so in reality, everybody in this room is already paying a carbon tax. Like Charlene mentioned, it's part of the environmental levy when you pay your electricity bill, and from the 5th of June this year, as a result of the carbon tax becoming effective, there was an 8 and 9 cent increase in petrol and diesel as a result of the carbon tax. And I think Treasury anticipates that they would collect close to 1.8 billion as a result of an increase in the fuel levy. Not all emissions would be subject to the tax, and I think maybe let me take you through particular timelines and what needs to be done when, and then I'll unpack how these emissions, if particular emissions are exposed to the carbon tax or not. So everything effectively starts with your obligation as industry to report your greenhouse gas emissions to the Department of Environmental Affairs, Fishery and Forestry. This is done through greenhouse gas reporting regulations, and the emissions that gets reported on would be your full calendar year emissions. So it doesn't necessarily run together with your financial year. It will be your full calendar year. That report gets submitted to the following year, calendar year, by the end of March. And the Department of Environmental Affairs and Fishery has got 60 days to respond or acknowledge that you have in fact applied the correct methodology. So those emissions that get reported on are your combustion emissions, your process emissions, and your fugitive emissions. And it's important to note that those are only Scope 1 emissions. And there's particular thresholds that gets applied to that. For example, for combustion fuels, the predominant threshold is 10 megawatt thermic input capacity. There's a number of other thresholds that deviate from the 10 megawatt thermic input capacity. For example, aviation and airborne navigation, that is 100,000 litres and 4 million bricks is an interesting threshold. And I think for ceramics, it's 50,000 tonnes, something of that nature. But safe to say that 80% of it is covered by the 10 megawatt thermal input capacity threshold. So that capacity threshold gets aggregated to a group level because the department's mandate is to establish a carbon inventory for the country. So the reporting happens at a group level and not necessarily at an entity level or facility level, even though that might be changing soon. So once you've established your amount of Scope 1 emissions, then you apply the particular, let's call it the carbon tax design. And Charlene mentioned that there are certain thresholds applicable to our carbon tax that will moderate the initial economic impact of the carbon tax. So, for example, on combustion emissions, there would be a default 60% tax-free threshold, effectively bringing down the exposed emissions from 120 Rand to 48 Rand per tonne. For fugitive and process emissions, there's not a lot that you can do, so they've been very accommodating and given that additional 10% on top of that. And then there's other mechanisms in which industry can literally take some control over and be very proactive in reducing the effective carbon tax impact even further. For example, trade-exposed industries. It could be that our local manufacturer of steel might be exposed to cheap imported steel that might not be taxed at source. That will give them an additional 10% in terms of the tax-free allowances. Also, if you can prove that you are, in fact, from a carbon intensity perspective, performing better than the national benchmark, that will give you another 5%. There's also the carbon offset mechanisms in which carbon offsets developed through CDM and the VCS would also qualify to give you another 5%. So you can see there's multiple things that industry can do and be proactive with to actually bring this carbon tax rate down from a, let's call it a basis 48 Rand to effectively a 6 Rand per tonne in theory. So once you've calculated your carbon tax, now you would have the month of July the following year to submit this levy payment to SARS. This will happen through the Customs and Excise Act, and at this point in time, we're not exact. The SARS regulations or rules are still open for comment. But I believe a particular IPCC activity, for example, cement manufacturing or energy and heat production, that IPCC code would be registered as an emissions warehouse. And all the emissions as a result of that activity would form part of your DA180 Customs and Excise form. It is an expense to business, so this is a tax deductible levy, if you can call it so. Yeah, so that's in short how it's going to work.
Okay, well, how many people in the room are less confused than when we started? Because I don't think I'm one of them. I'm so glad that we have specialists like Gerard and Jocelyn who are going to help industry through this, because it really is a new thing for a lot of people, and that's why we had this panel today. You mentioned something, and I saw Sharon nodding her head, and I'm thinking Gerard and Ilse from DTI in the front are probably also nodding their heads, because this was a really interesting thing I picked up. You mentioned that there is going to be some sort of hedge, and I'd like to come back to it later, and not answer it now if you would, for those who are trade exposed. So those sectors where there are other challenges that they face, there's some sort of protection for them so they don't, literally drown under the burden. And also, Gerard mentioned, so this is now where Alf is going to come in, because Gerard mentioned a number of areas in which, when companies are reporting, they can show that they've been doing some really good stuff, and there would be some sort of levy rebate or a hedge or something for them. And I'm going to leave the technicalities to those who know. But Alf Hudsenberg has been leading a project at the NCPC now that has been running since 2010. And those of you who are going to the energy session tomorrow will see his presentation that shows some of the wonderful statistics. But just off the top of my head, I can remember that the IEE project that Alf leads has helped industry to mitigate over 4 million tons of GHG emissions. That's 4 million tons. That's a lot of CO2 equivalent that will not be taxed because people are being efficient. So Alf, my question to you for the room is, what is it that resource efficiency, cleaner production, energy efficiency offers industry that can help them address this issue?
Thank you, Julie. Before I jump into that, what I'd like to do is maybe step back and just share with you a perception that we have gained over many years of working with industry. And my colleague from National Treasury rightly calls this a crisis, a climate change crisis, a climate science crisis. And the question is, why are we in this crisis? We have a target to halve our emissions in 6 years. And whether you agree with the carbon tax or you don't agree with it, or whether you think the carbon tax is not stringent enough, that's one heavy target to achieve. And a concern that I have, and have harbored for a while, is the attitude of business. Business have for a long while enjoyed the benefits of cheap energy. And failed to recognize the risks implicit in pursuing cheaper fossil fuels in favor of good earnings before interest and tax, good earnings price, good price earnings yields, good performances in the business, and ignored that. And today we still find company owners, large, medium company managers that do not have an emissions KPI equivalent to their financial KPIs in their business. So we can understand when we engage industry from the NCPC's point of view, why it is so difficult for middle managers and engineers and utility managers and SHEC managers that are on our side and understand the challenge to elevate some of those energy efficiency programs and some of those CO2 mitigation programs, how difficult they have it within the companies to elevate that to serious company consideration at a board level for capex allocation and things like that. So if you argue and you said to me, yes, Alf, we had to do it because we needed to remain globally competitive, then I say to you, we've hidden behind a cheap fuel to hide our inefficiencies in manufacturing and elsewhere. The point is, when the rest of the world started moving away from carbon, we continued to pursue that. And I don't believe that if it was not for this carbon tax, we would have had no chance, no way of changing attitudes in business and driving the changes that we need to see. And the services that the NCPC offers is essentially and largely fully subsidized by the DTI and other international agencies. And yet the take-up of that is dismally poor. And we have to ask ourselves why. It's because at the top of both company senior management, top management platforms and forums, it's still ultimately profit, short-term profits that dictate decisions. Short-term cash flow initiatives and priorities that dictate decisions. So when we come along as the NCPC and we start to talk to them about how they can do things differently, and many times without spending much or any money, it's not accepted at first. It's not accepted easily. There are exceptions. We have in South Africa really pioneering, champion companies in all sectors that are doing really very well. And if any, are probably well positioned for this carbon tax. And even if it was without all its concessions and allowances, if it was 120 Rand per ton, they would still be well set. But by and large, the NCPC sadly still struggles to convince business South Africa to change the way they perceive and they manage emissions in the business. And to look beyond this initial tax year or financial year, or maybe beyond the next 3 financial years, and consider what a world would be like with average global temperatures above 2 degrees Celsius. South Africa is an identified hotspot globally, and the World Bank has identified that average temperatures in South Africa will be double that of the global average. Now, I would hate to see that if we don't achieve this 2%, 2 degrees Celsius global average temperature increase by 2025 or 2030, I would hate to see what a South Africa at plus 4 degrees Celsius would be like. So really, our perspective in the NCPC, and particularly the IEE project, is to convince companies to consider CO2 emissions and energy efficiency projects as important as the profitability that they chase. And in pursuant of that, I think the carbon tax starts to focus the mind. And there are many that believe that it's way too soft and way too weak to to secure that orientation that's necessary to halve our emissions in 6 years. But whether that is so or not is not the issue. If the one thing it does, it starts to bring emissions, emission targets, and energy efficiency programs into the conversation, the boardroom conversation, the executive and top management conversation in businesses, then I believe that it is starting to do the right thing. Because then I believe we can start addressing those. And there are ways, there are approaches that companies can undertake to address that. And one of the first things we normally appeal to companies when you start this journey is understand where you're at. Establish a baseline. What are your emissions now? Set yourself the targets that you need to achieve in the next 3 to 6 years. And then develop the action plan that you need to undertake to achieve those targets. And those could be a whole range of things. They could range from simple energy efficiency projects within your building or within your plot. They could also talk to simply just starting to interrogate the heating and cooling that happens in your plot, because heating and cooling by its very nature is energy intensive. And query and interrogate those set points that you have. Start to make sure that you buy in more broadly and that you make this something that your team and your top management buy into. Not because they're compelled to and they have to comply, but because they believe in it. And ultimately keep your top management accountable. Have a checklist to see that they are still reviewing this as a top business KPI. That it's not all about the profits, but it's about the emissions as well. And maybe then we can start to have a small chance of achieving this target that we've set ourselves with the commitment to the Paris Agreement. Thanks.
Thank you, Alf. I don't think I can really add anything to that. So I actually called Alf in on this. The one thing I would ask you, Alf, before you hand the mic over, you take 1 minute quickly and tell the story of one of the big company savers. Either the big metal company down south or one of the other big ones. Just quickly, just so that people know that we are not just here to preach, that there's actually a real saving in the bag.
Yeah, Julie loves this one. But there are many good ones. I can sit here and talk for days. But the one I think Julie refers to is a company where the energy manager asked the GM on his visit to the head office in Johannesburg to table a request to implement our energy management system. He called her on the Friday night and he said to her, "Annette, I've got good news and I've got bad news." And she said, "Give me the bad news first." And he said, "The board declined your offer. They're not interested in it." And she said, "The good news?" He says, "I'm taking the decision and I'm telling you, go ahead and do it." And she implemented the energy management system. And it's integrated steel mill that was teetering on the brink of closure. Global steel prices were soft. Productivity levels in the plant were not particularly world-class. And they employed at the time about maybe 900 permanent employees and another 2,500 contract employees. And she she joined our program in 2011. A year later, she successfully implemented the energy management system. In the first year, that company saved 60 million rand for an investment of about 500,000 rand. Now, the point I made earlier was, think back to what I said earlier about business attitude. The board declined it. They didn't see the value in it. They didn't see the value in it because they didn't understand it. In the second year, and she continued to do incredible work. By the third year, Renette had saved that company through no low-cost savings, 127 million rand. And she said it's not fictitious savings. You could see it in the monthly electricity bills they had to pay. And more recently, she'd since been promoted. She's now a business development manager, no longer an energy manager. More recently, a plant engineer came to our office in Cape Town and said, I need help. Come and have a look at our pump systems and just tell us what we're doing wrong. So we got one of our seriously senior experts in pump systems, and we got him down there for 7 days. And we said to him, no measurements, no deep measurements. Just take a walk and have a look, scope the plant. And we went back 3 months later, we delivered the scoping report to them. And a month following that, without any request for an appointment for a meeting, he walks into our offices and knocks on my door. And he says, I just want to tell you we saved 1 million kilowatt hours for no cost, at no cost. So what we are finding, and this is not only a South African thing, this is a global, and this has been repeated globally, both in OECD and non-OECD countries, that you don't initially have to spend money to save energy. That you can make significant inroads into your energy bill and into your energy performance with spending maybe only your OPEX, your operational expenses. Tap into your maintenance budget. But you don't have to tap into heavy CapEx initially to achieve this. Eventually, you need to, once you've exhausted those options, you have to spend to save. But that is one example, and we have many, many more of those that indicate how we took a personal decision from somebody in the business to make the difference against all odds and against general consensus within top management groups within businesses. Thank you, Julie.
Thanks. The other reason, of course, I like that story is you notice it's a lady. It was a she. And so we actually pride ourselves at the NCPC and being an agency that not only operates on behalf of the Department of Trade and Industry and Environment, Forestry and Fishery and the South African government, but it was actually established as it was then and through the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. And our partnership with UNIDO still is extremely strong today. And we are really pleased to have brought into the decisions. And I mean, we have a young lady who's flown up at her own expense. She was an intern at our internship program. I think it was last year, I believe. She has flown up at her own expense because she believes so passionately in this that she's left Cape Town for 2 days to come to this conference so that she can actually learn more, contribute more, and take more back to where she's going to work. Because the young people, they understand what's at stake here, and they are easily changed. And UNIDO and our partnership with UNIDO has ensured that we bring gender mainstreaming into this as well. So throughout the next 2 days, you will see a number of wonderful women presenting along with equally wonderful men. And we want you to remember that gender mainstreaming and the development of the youth in this industry is just as important as the saving of GHG emissions. So, Jocelyn, the reason I had Alf tell at least one story is because he has mentioned a couple of wonderful opportunities that I would like you to sort of wrap up the presentation part of our panel now and tell the room what is available to them to ensure that this burden is not as heavy. And I know that you're one of those M&V specialists. These people blow my mind. M&V is measurement and verification. Very, very different people to the M&E that all companies like to do, which is monitoring and evaluation. Now, measurement and verification usually takes some extremely clever people, and they're over there, and then they bring their results to the very clever tax people, and between the two of them, they can compile this data into something that can help a company to benefit from the efforts that they've made to save energy and therefore GHG emissions. So maybe we can touch on 12L and the other mechanisms within the carbon tax that are available.
Great, thanks, Julie. So I'm going to talk briefly about how you reduce your carbon tax liability as companies. And I think, to touch on what Alf was saying, I mean, I suppose what the intention of the carbon tax is to really make companies think differently about reducing emissions and to price in the externalities of greenhouse gas emissions. And so I guess really what you should be doing as a company before looking at all of the other mechanisms that are available is looking at how you reduce your energy consumption and you reduce your emissions. Not only does it help you to reduce your carbon tax liability, but also your operating costs. And I think one of the things that'll help is that, the carbon tax will kind of help to build the business case for a number of these projects. And I know historically that's been a challenge, is that, for the plant managers or the SHEC people on sites is really to motivate for projects. So that although they can see the opportunity, the financial directors or the top management are not really interested unless the payback is less than 3 years, and in some case, in this kind of environment, less than 1 year. And so what the carbon tax helps to do is to, I guess, reframe the conversation and also to raise the conversation to the level of top management, to the financial director. And so I think the starting point is really to look at ways to reduce your energy consumption and your carbon emissions, and to make use of the NCPC in that regard. And then on top of that, to build the business case for these kind of projects. So once these projects have been identified, there are a number of grants and incentives available. And just to touch briefly on them, because we won't have time to go into great detail on all of them, one of the ones that I want to touch on first is really the Section 12L Energy Efficiency Tax Incentive. So that's a tax incentive that allows you to claim a tax deduction of 95 cents per kilowatt hour saved. The benefit is available for 12 months. It is a tax deduction, but it can really help to build the business case for a project. And there's a set process through which you would access the incentive, but it's a very well-run incentive. And just acknowledgements to Sanedi who run the incentive. And so if you are implementing energy efficiency projects, then it's really worth having a look at accessing 12L. One of the things you need to have for 12L is a baseline, so you need to understand what your energy consumption is before you implement the project, and that's something that the NCPC can also assist with. And then post the implementation of the project, you need to quantify the energy savings. One of the things that it requires is sign-off by a SANIS accredited measurement and verification professional or company. But all of this basically is really worth it if you are implementing projects. And there are various ways that you can structure the project in order to access 12L at a cost that is reasonable for the project. And then apart from 12L, there's various other grants and incentives, quite a few available from international organizations. For example, if you're implementing projects around greenhouse gas emissions or awareness creation around greenhouse gas emissions, there's a great foundation called the Minor Foundation for Major Challenges, and they offer cash grants to companies that are looking at energy or greenhouse gas emissions quite differently. Now, that's just one of the kind of donor funds that are available, but there are a myriad of donor funds available depending on the nature of your project and the benefits of your project. And then one of the other things to bear in mind is that the carbon tax has a number of allowances through which you can reduce your liability, obviously to allow companies really to transition into paying the carbon tax. I'm not going to touch on all of the different allowances at this stage, but one of the ones that I think is quite interesting is the carbon offset allowance. So companies can reduce their liability by between 5 and 10%. By utilizing what's called a carbon offset. Now, a carbon offset is an investment in an emission reduction project that is outside of your taxable boundary. So basically, if you're going to, for example, install solar panels on low-cost housing, those solar panels reduce greenhouse gas emissions by displacing electricity from the grid, and you can potentially claim those as carbon offsets. And there's obviously also, again, a process to go through it to access carbon offsets. But one of the benefits is that once you've got a project registered, you can claim those carbon credits for either 10 years or 21 years. So the benefit is repeated year on year. The other thing is that, as a company, you need to look at maybe how do these kind of offset projects address other challenges? So can you align an offset project with your CSI, with your community development, with your supply chain? How do we invest in other businesses as corporates? How do we grow our supply chain by utilizing things like offsets? For example, if you are in the packaging industry and you're involved in recycling, how do you encourage the growth of SMMEs in that value chain by utilizing offsets for your recycling process, which reduces emissions? So we need to start thinking about these things and potentially thinking differently about these things. But yeah, that's something that's really exciting, is the ability to access offsets, and hopefully we'll see the growth in the kind of local carbon offset market. But that's also something to bear in mind when you're trying to build business cases for these projects to reduce your emissions. I guess the last thing I want to touch on is just if you are, in terms of quantifying your carbon tax liability, which Gerard spoke to, just making sure that you are quantifying it in such a way that it is obviously compliant but conservative. So there's a number of different calculation methodologies or tiers, tier 1, 2, and 3. And those basically, either you use a default emission factor for your emissions, or you use a supplier-specific or country-specific emission factor. Some of the default emission factors do overstate emissions, and that's just because they've been developed to be globally applicable. Whereas if you are able to access ones applicable to your process and obviously go through the approval process, that may significantly reduce your emissions. An example is potentially the aviation industry, where the default for Jet A1 fuel overestimates their emissions quite significantly. So if they use supplier-specific emission factors or calorific values, then they are able to accurately quantify their emissions, but also at the same time to make sure that they are conservative in the estimation of their carbon tax liability.
Thank you. We have reached the end of the sort of presentation stage. I'm going to be honest with you. We've actually almost reached the end of the plenary session. But we're going to steal about another 10 minutes. We'll steal a little bit of time from tea. So if you wouldn't mind, when you leave, grabbing your tea, deciding on which session you're going to, and getting there by just before 11. But I'm going to actually read a couple of the questions that have been sent. Now, thanks to those who've sent, we've had over 30 questions sent to us. We couldn't possibly answer them all at this session, but I will undertake to ensure that we actually share these questions on the app over the next day or two, and then eventually on our website, and we will get answers. And I'm going to impose on my panel over the next couple of days to make sure we do get accurate answers for you. But a lot of people, Shalene, have asked this question, so I'm going to pose this question to you first. Has government decided what the money is going to be used for? A lot of people want to know, is this money going to be ring-fenced, and is it going to be used for something specific to, for example, environmental change? Okay, start with a rough one, guys.
No, the money will be lost in a black hole called the National Revenue Fund. Look, yeah, this is a question that comes up in every discussion around the carbon tax, around environmental taxes in general, fuel taxes, etc. But just maybe to take the technical official position, which is that, earmarking is not supported by the Treasury. And the reason for that is, there is a risk that you might over or under allocate funding to a particular priority. So that's the reason why it's not generally supported. But in the context of the carbon tax, there's been a whole range of technical work done, and we did do a carbon tax modeling exercise together with a few other academics that have done some work. And what the study did show was that with the introduction of the carbon tax, what you do with the money is important in terms of how that would impact on economic growth. And the language we used, so in future I would say, don't use the word ring fencing, use the word recycled. So how would the funds be recycled? For some reason this is more attractive to the Treasury. So the funds are not earmarked per se, but we've committed to recycle the money, and recycling some of this money, as I mentioned earlier, in the context of saying no impact on electricity prices for the first phase, through the offset of the electricity generation levy. Second, was that in our electricity pricing, we have an IPP tariff, and part of this is linked to the Renewable Energy IPP program. So the purchase of that electricity, that amount can be offset against the carbon tax liability of an electricity generator. And at this stage, this applies beyond Eskom. So those are the two big measures on recycling. The third one, which has been spoken a lot about and probably will be spoken about later, is the 12L incentive. So we have done some costing of this incentive, and there's a conservative estimate of around 3 billion that has been the cost of this incentive. And the biggest beneficiaries, and Barry is here, he can testify to that, the biggest beneficiaries under the 12L is basically your manufacturing and mining sectors. And if you're looking at mining is one of the energy intensive users, and there's an argument it will be impacted by the tax. I'm just going to take this opportunity to make two comments. As the Treasury, we tend to do that. Just firstly to say that when we started this conversation on carbon taxation, it was basically the official or the worker, it's almost in the back room. These days, we get queries directly from CEOs of companies wanting to know that I have a boiler, can you please tell me if we are subject to the carbon tax? So the very thought of paying a penalty through a tax has now reached the boardroom, where decisions are being made in the context of what is the cost of this carbon tax, how do I reduce my tax liability, how do I avoid the tax in a legal way. So just to share some of that, which means that those people dealing with safety, health, environment issues, environment auditing, etc., you probably have a job for a long time, but it's now your opportunity to put forward these projects, investments around energy efficiency, renewable energy, forestry type projects, waste projects that could get buy-in at board level. And then just the second comment, which was raised earlier, was around competitiveness. There is the big argument around, you're introducing these environmental policies and there's going to be a huge impact on the competitiveness of industries. The status quo has changed. We are now operating in a carbon-constrained world. We are now operating in a world that is materials-constrained, as we heard. And in South Africa, very, very water-constrained. So the reality is that as we move forward, if we don't change the way in which products are manufactured, there's a massive risk that we will face retaliatory tariffs from other countries whom we export to. And this has been the case with aviation. So to the extent that the EU threatened to impose, to include the aviation sector as part of its carbon pricing measures, including flights into the EU, the rest of the world suddenly had to look at it and say, okay, but what are we doing domestically? So there is an argument to say that environmental policies, putting a price on externalities, can actually make us more competitive over the short, medium, longer term. And the trade exposure allowance, which is provided under the carbon tax, it's a 10% allowance, and it's basically applied at a sector level. The analysis that we have done has shown that mining, iron and steel would basically qualify for the full 10% allowance. So they will essentially qualify for the basic allowance of 60%, where 60% of your emissions are tax-free. They are likely to qualify for a process emissions allowance of 10%, which takes them to 70%, 10% on the trade exposure, which takes them to 80%, 5% on a carbon budget allowance, we can talk about that a bit later, which takes you to 85%, and then the possibility of using carbon offsets, which can take you to 90-95%. So the way the tax is structured is that it provides those allowances across the board to all sectors, sector-specific, and it's coupled with specific incentives. So I would say just use it as an opportunity to change the conversation at a company level.
Wow, I think if you leave today and you haven't learned anything, you haven't been listening. I've got a question for you, Gerard. The person wants to know, what about small companies? We talked a lot about the burden that's going to be placed on these big sectors. Do small companies need to be concerned? Do they need to report? How does it affect them?
I think small companies certainly need to look into the criteria set for the greenhouse gas emissions reporting. So, for example, and this could have probably been a bit of unintended consequences for carbon tax, but the thermal thresholds actually get aggregated from a facility level to an entity level. So if you just think about the food sector, fast-moving consumer goods also, is that you could have 300-400 bakeries, for example, across the country. And collectively, they will breach that 10 megawatt thermal threshold. And therefore, they would be subject to the carbon tax, even though the various facilities themselves are relatively small in terms of emission activities. Banks, especially companies with a lot of distributed backup generation. So, for example, the cell phone companies, data centers, for example, that has backup generation purely for the purpose of load shedding. Collectively, those backup generators easily add up to 10 megawatt thermal, which gives you that reporting obligation. Does not necessarily say that the carbon tax impact thereof would be high, because it's just the threshold is just sits at a thermal input capacity, but ultimately the tax only gets paid on the amount of emissions emitted. But certainly it would have an impact on smaller businesses, no doubt.
Okay, thank you. I have another question that has sort of been asked multiple times in a few different ways. Jocelyn, I'm going to pose this to you. Some are asking about processes, others were asking about on a company level. What can companies do when they really have optimized as far as they can? Are there sort of retrospective brownie points or something? So what can companies do if they feel that there is no more room for improvement? And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Alf for a little bit of a comment on that question as well. And we're going to make that our last question and wrap up.
Great. So I think, as a company, once you've calculated your liability conservatively, you've made use of the allowances, you've also looked at something called sequestration, you've looked at offsetting, and you feel like you've also reduced your emissions as far as possible. Obviously, then it becomes, I guess, about more capital-intensive projects and implementing those projects. So there is, like Alf was saying earlier, there is a lot of stuff you can do at low cost and potentially still do at low cost to reduce your emissions. You could do fuel switching, etc., but I guess there comes a point at which you would have to pay the tax, or you would have to invest in technology which is potentially less emissions intensive. And that's when it becomes about trying to build the business case for these technologies by leveraging off various grants and incentives, and obviously also building the impact of the carbon tax into your financial models.
Thank you. I'd like to respond to earlier comments and questions. And we just heard how mining and iron and steel sector can almost benefit by as much as 95%. So I sit there and I say to myself, if I'm a owner of a steel plant, or does that really incentivize me to do anything about my CO2 emissions? And that's my issue, and I don't mean to be controversial, is that if we're going to make this tax work, and I'm glad to see that they're actually calling up and asking about the boilers, but we need to take the pain somewhere between now and 2025 if we're going to get it down by 42%. So that's an issue I have, and I think we have to see a mindset change and an approach change that don't need a carbon tax to make us do it. The question about smaller companies, I think there are many smaller companies flying below the radar. If you're a small company with a boiler, a steam boiler, or the capacity of maybe 2 or 2.5 ton, and you're using less than 1.4 and using less than 1.4 ton per hour of its capacity, you will not be liable. And we've worked on and assumed some calorific values and developed some thresholds on that. And I'll gladly share that with all of you to give you an indication of where you are. But a concern that I have is in the workshops we've had with industry, the first thing that comes to mind is, how can I trade my offsets? And I say, wait a minute, forget the offsets. How can you improve your energy performance and mitigate your CO2 emissions first? And that is my message to industry is, offsets are great. They're going to help you make this less painful. But ultimately, the goal should be to look at how you're doing what you're doing, to produce what you're doing, and sell what you're doing, and try and do it with a lower carbon footprint. And that, to me, should be the first thing we do. And once we've done that, as well as we could do it, is see if we can soften the pain by maybe starting to trade in offsets. And by trading in carbon offsets, we can make it more palatable. And by starting to review older projects that we reviewed 5 years ago and seeing whether they are now more viable under these new offsets, that may be something you want to do. But to answer the question directly, when you have maxed out everything you can do in terms of energy efficiency, then I would like to think that it's time to maybe look at renewables and start to look at larger capex projects. Hopefully by that time, top management would have in some way found a weighting system that would compensate environmental capex projects against those that simply buy greater market share or better product quality or better productivity as well. So I hope that addresses it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Please join me in thanking the panel. I think they did an amazing job. Okay, just to reiterate, there were a number of questions we did not get to. We have got them. We captured them all, and we will endeavor to answer each one as far as possible over the next few days. Please keep an eye on your app, and we will probably be around during tea, but we do have access to them via email, etc. And then please make your way to be able to start your first breakaway session by 11. There is some amazing things to be learned, and a lot of the questions you've asked will in fact be answered in these sessions. Whoa, I'm breaking up. I think batteries are going flat. In this venue, there will be the circular economy and life cycle management. Across the hall in the Ruby Auditorium will be the green chemistry session. Upstairs will be water in the Onyx, Garnet and Crystal venue. And then on that side, the last room on your left before you get to the bathrooms, that is where the Foundries workshop will be. And I think there's a lot to be learned in all 4 of these venues. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your conference.